Hello, hello, and welcome to our weekly book club episode here at Homeschool Moms Unfiltered. If you're new to our podcast, don't panic. There was no required reading to show up and listen in this week. So we'll explain all of that in just a minute. But first, I'm your host, Amanda, and my bookworm co-host is...
Hello, I'm Meagan.
Hey. All right, so our current book club selection is Differently Wired by Deborah, or Debbie, as she goes by on some of her other things, Reber. So it's...
Yeah. It is good. We're loving this book. So, it's a reread for both of us, but it's been a number of years since we first read it. And so it's been really great to revisit it with a few more years of parenting under our belts, right? You see things a little bit differently. So how does book club work here?
Well, you can truly approach it any way that works for you, right? First and foremost. Some people like to read along with us, and with this book, we totally encourage that. It's a really solid read. But others choose to just tune in and simply listen to our kind of digest version of the book. Either way, it does not matter to us. We are just thrilled you're here. So this is our fourth episode on this specific book. If you've missed the previous three, feel free to pop back. Just look at our kind of episode list, wherever you prefer to read, listen, watch, whatever. And you can catch the other ones. We're going really slow, a chapter a week so far. I think we're going to speed up a little, but yeah, easy enough to catch up if you'd like.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and we have some super exciting news for you this week. The author of Differently Wired, Deborah Reber, will be joining us for an author Q&A episode soon. We always love it when an author comes. We get a little fangirly when it happens. So if you're reading along with us, feel free to pop any questions that you have about the book so far, or if you've already read it and you've read ahead, whatever, pop those in the comments. We will do our best to work as many listener questions into our time with Deborah as possible.
Yeah. I still don't exactly know how we pull this off. I'm still kind of stuck in that mindset of hey, we'll be doing better than 50% of podcasts if we just twist the arms of all of our friends and family into listening to the podcast. And we're so far past that. I'm still not entirely sure how we've done it, but it's awesome. It's awesome that we're here, that we're doing it.
Okay, somebody said the other day, how do I find your podcast? And I was literally I didn't say it, but after I answered the question, and then afterwards I was thinking about the question. And I was literally, if you put Homeschool Moms Unfiltered into Google, you will just get 3 full pages of stuff related to the book. And neither one of us know anything. Well, at least I'll speak for myself. I don't know about you. I know nothing about search engine optimization. So that was not a strategic move there. It just kind of happened. So I'm yeah, this is happening. How cool is that?
Yep, exactly. All right, so one last thing before we dive in. If you would like to read along with us, there's a link to our bookshop.org page in the show notes. We do, if you go back in our social media, you will see we also have an Amazon affiliate account, as many online creators do, but we are working hard to move everything over to bookshop.org where possible. It is an awesome place, a resource, because you can put orders through their site. And then the order is pushed out to small bookshops around the country. So you're actually supporting small independent bookshops. We do get a little kind of brownie point, sometimes commission, very small. We're not buying anything. We're not even buying the book with the commission, but we do get a little bit through our site. And so we appreciate your support there. But you can also just shop with confidence, knowing that you're not supporting Amazon, and every little bit of sticking it to Amazon feels good these days.
It really does, right?
Yeah.
So today we will be covering chapters 4 and 5. And you might be thinking, wow, if you've been listening along with us, impressive. They've only been doing 1 chapter a week. And now we're going to do 2 chapters. But spoiler alert, chapter 5 is 4 pages long. So
even in the actual book, it's not even 2 full pages.
So, but hey, we'll give ourselves credit for that one. So let's dive in. Chapter 4 is called What's Keeping Us Stuck? And it looks like I might have the first note, Amanda.
Yeah.
Okay. So right at the beginning of the chapter, it says here, there is an immeasurable value in simply fitting in. And this is part of a larger discussion that she's having about parents who are trying to balance this need for having people recognize how unique and awesome their kid is, but then also having their kid fit in and having their kid kind of go through life in a smoother way. And it all kind of points towards this conversation of who defined normal? Why did that become the standard that we quote unquote all aspire to, etc.? And so when I first read this line, there is an immeasurable value in simply fitting in. I thought, I don't really, I have no interest in fitting in, but I think it's important to take a step back too. There's all of these discussions out there in books that you read and stuff like that about how, generally speaking, many women, not all women, because you can never say all, but many women grow into their confidence and who they are as they age. And both of us are in our 40s. And so we're in that, like, giving less and less a fuck about what other people think of us as we age and all of that, right? The other thing that I think comes with that is we've both been homeschooling for so long and been in this community that embraces different in more ways, I think, than typical for so long, that if you're new to homeschooling, you might not quite have that comfort zone yet that long-term homeschoolers might find. And similarly, even if we happen to be in that position of being like, I'm so comfortable with who I am, take me or leave me, right? And if I'm too much for you, go find less, right? As Elise Myers likes to say. But our kids might not be, right? That came with age. I think when I was their age, I wasn't feeling that way. There was a desire to try to fit in, not be the odd duck, which I always was. So I think it's important for me when I read that, I was like, when I read it as myself, I was like, who cares about fitting in? But it's like, okay, but that is a huge part of society. And our kids who are younger, who haven't developed their sense of self the same way that we might have, that might be important to them.
I think that's true, but I do also think on the flip side, especially if you are a neurotypical parent raising a differently wired kid, if you find that your differently wired kid doesn't really care that much about fitting in and they're not trying particularly hard to fit in, I think there's a tendency for neurotypical parents to worry about that and try to encourage their kids to fit in and to worry, like, why don't they want to fit in? And that's one of those things. I know for me, I'm sure I did care more when I was younger, but I have never cared too much. And I have worked hard my kiddo has that same tendency. And I have worked hard to really help that grow and flourish. This idea of like, yes, be kind and show up in the world in kindness and this kind of stuff. But you can still be who you are and be proud of who you are and be proud of your differences and the fact that you march to the beat of your own drum. And that's okay, And so I think there are definitely kids out there who are trying, and we need to remember that. And there are kids who are not particularly interested, and we should also encourage that and support that, I think. And that's not something that we talk so much about. There's not a lot out there saying like, hey, encourage your kid to be the black sheep. Encourage them to be the weird one. Like, that's awesome. But it can be, right? I mean, yeah. So just after that, she kind of continues on. And then the next paragraph has this quote. She says, but how did we get here in the first place? What factors have ensured the status quo where sameness, fitting in, and conformity are so highly prized and embraced? How has this current paradigm, one that encourages labels, medications, and quick fixes for everything outside the norm, been able to flourish? I know one thing for certain. It's being perpetuated and reinforced every day by a culture and a system that don't want to make room for anything else. And it's not exactly a happy quote. There have been quite a few quotes in this book that I pulled out that I wouldn't really call a happy quote, but it's important to know. And we say all the time, you can't do better until you know better. And you have to admit and address things to be able to like make that change at the foundational level. I think it's important to remember. Okay, so then my next comment was just a little bit further on. So she starts breaking things up into kind of like her subheadings. And the next one is called the neurotypical parenting experience. And in that, she is talking about an issue that she has with a couple things that regularly go around Facebook. Now, I was kind of oblivious to things in our last episode earlier this week, but I have seen these ones go around Facebook. So there are two that she brings up. The first one is, quote, your child's success or lack of success in sports, does not indicate what kind of parent you are, but having an athlete that is coachable, respectful, a great teammate, mentally tough, resilient, and tries their best is a direct reflection of your parenting, end quote. And then the second one that she brings up is, quote, we need to care less about whether our children are academically gifted and more about whether they sit with the lonely kid in the cafeteria, end quote. And yeah, have you seen these, Meagan? I know I've definitely.
100%.
Yeah. And so she is saying that she feels like they're both hurtful to differently wired kids. And she goes into quite a bit of detail about what things she finds hurtful and where she finds that. And this is one of those things I'm not sure how much is that I have, my privilege in having a kiddo who is differently wired, but, can pass fairly well in mainstream things. I feel like with many things, I'm sure there are people who are not open to exceptions. But for me, I see this and I think like, yes, obviously there are exceptions for kiddos who are wired differently, but there's a lot of truth in both of these things, right? I don't think that you can be a parent, especially in the United States, and say, oh, I haven't seen a parent who cares way more about how successful their kid is in sports than whether or not their kid is like a good teammate in general, and like supportive of their teammates and kind to their coach, like that is 100% absolutely a thing in the United States. And we've talked before about how often parents want to brag that their kids are gifted, whether they are gifted or not. And I don't think that it has to be one of those, like, your kid can be gifted or they can be kind. But I think we have all met the parent or know of the parent who talks about how gifted their kid is, but never actually takes a step back and like, oh, but we also want to make sure that we're fostering kindness and empathy. And so I don't know. I was just like, I wonder how much of this is like rooted in personal trauma, because we all have that, right? How much of this is a difference in the fact that she had spent a lot of her time parenting outside of the US. And so maybe not seeing firsthand how off the rails some of this stuff is going in the United States, or how much of it is just almost 10 years on, how much more pervasive some of this is. I don't know. So I was curious your thoughts on it.
I didn't highlight anything in that section really, except a little blurb where I just kind of was like, it's wise to take a moment before you share things online and think about how other people might perceive this or how it might affect people who have a different experience in the world than you. But I didn't take it as, I took it as her life experience. And I was like, oh, that's how she experienced those posts. I've seen those posts, kind of like whatever, they're clickbait things. I mean, they're usually posted by accounts that are generating revenue by posting ridiculous things that they know is going to fire people up and get people debating and whatever. So I kind of take it for what it is. But I did like the fact that she talked about the fact that your gifted child would also sit with the kid who's lonely at lunch. And she goes, odds are pretty good that your gifted child is the kid who's lonely at lunch. I was like, okay. That also can be very true in some circumstances. So, or might be a kid who's sitting at lunch by themselves and not care that they're alone, right? Like one of my kids would be like,
to be left alone for lunch.
I mean, sometimes my kids would be like, oh, thank God, because I was like, it's been such a day and I just wanted to sit and eat my lunch at peace and quiet and not have to make small talk with people that I don't know.
Yeah, that totally reminds me, actually, we're rewatching Gilmore Girls from the very beginning, me and the kiddo. And there's this whole thing where Rory's at her fancy prep school, and at lunch, she sits alone and reads her book. And they came, and like, oh, she's a loner and she has no friends and you've got to get involved, and became this whole thing. And she does ultimately push back and she's like, well, look, my friends aren't here and you don't care about where I come from or the fact that I have all of these friends and I have this life and all of these things outside of your precious prep school. But then the whole thing kind of ends with they finally say, okay, fine, you can go back to reading at lunch by yourself. And some new girl comes and sits down at her table and opens up her book. And there had been kind of this running joke about like, can't I make a club for people who want to sit quietly at lunch and read? And it's like, oh, I kind of made that club, after all of these, it's a whole thing. But yeah, I joined the silent book club, like where people just get together and silently read together. I'm like, I'm totally like perfect. Hey,
Definitely. All right. I have the next comment on 61, which, okay, so I have 2 paragraphs that I wanted to kind of call out here. The first was, I think I've got quite a string of things coming actually. So the first was, she says,
I was just gonna say it's that perfect thing. I had like the comments, and then you're like, oh, I didn't really mark anything in there. And then when I was typing up notes, I'm like, holy smokes, I didn't do anything in this like whole string of pages that she's got all these comments. Like, okay.
we complimented each other then. So the quote that I called out on 61 is a follow-up to what Amanda just said about the 2 posts on Facebook. And the quote from the book is, these 2 examples are emblematic of the ways parents raising neurotypical kids unwittingly perpetuate and reinforce a status quo that is harmful to differently wired children everywhere. Messages like these and the somewhat ignorant sentiment behind them are indicative of the privilege parents with neurotypical kids enjoy without even realizing it. Their experience is the norm, and if the rest of us can't adapt and conform accordingly, we're simply out of luck. And so I thought that was kind of in a nutshell, a societal point to be raised. Then she goes on to talk about this example with this woman named Barry, who has an ADHD, auditory processing disorder, and executive function challenged kiddo. And she says Barry hoped that being proactive and talking to coaches, teachers, and program directors ahead of time would get everyone on the same page and allow her son to have a successful experience like the rest of us. And this spoke so loudly to me because I used to do this when my kids were in programs. I had this template that I created. None of this will surprise you, Amanda. I had this template that I created. It was a 1-pager, and it was done in like newsletter style. So it had different blocks and whatever. And I would make one for each kid for their first day of school when they went to school, mainly for my older 2, when they were younger and they went to the synagogue for preschool. Everybody knew them. It was really small and family. But once they went to the big school with 1,600 kids, I had read something online that says teachers spend like the first month of school basically just figuring out who these kids are. And it's such a huge project. So I thought, okay, fine. I'll give you a little jump start into like a couple of things that get my kid talking, a couple of like things about the way they learn best or whatever. But it was really, really short and succinct and concise because I know they have a lot on their plate and they have all these kids, right? So I did it for kindergarten. I did it for first grade. Great. No problem. Second grade, my husband was undergoing cancer treatment. And so of all things, it became super essential for me to let them know that things were difficult at home, right? And if I dropped the ball on signing a permission slip or something like that, like it wasn't because I wasn't invested in my kids or their education. It was just that I was drowning. And then I also wanted them to know that if anyone in the classroom was sick, I really needed my kids separated from those kids as best as humanly possible. Whatever they could do, or if something pops up in the classroom, like chicken pox or whatever, I need to know about it. I mean, you don't have to tell me who it is. I don't expect you to violate anyone's privacy, but I need to know about it. This is really urgent. So my kiddo had 2 teachers because he was in a dual language program. He spent 3 hours with an English teacher in the morning, 3 hours with a Spanish speaking teacher in the afternoon. And they did all subjects in both classes. So they learned math and Spanish and social studies and Spanish and all that, right? I go to a meeting, a parent-teacher conference, like halfway through the year or something like that. And I referenced something about my husband having cancer. And one of his teachers was complete, like just blank face, deer in the headlights. Never opened the thing, never opened the envelope that I gave her. And I was like, it was a 1-pager. I didn't write you a novel. He's got multiple diagnoses. He's a 2E kiddo. Like, I was just trying to give you some keys to help unlock my kiddo, like anything to make it smoother for him, smoother for you, whatever. Also, it's a safety concern because of my husband right now, blah, blah, blah. Never read it. And it was obvious. And she just kind of sat there like, oh, okay then. And so I totally felt Barry's predicament there. The next thing that she has on page 61 says, and here you go, although admittedly accommodating the needs of differently wired kids in such activities may involve more effort, time, and resources than many organizations can provide. that doesn't make the outcome any less harmful or unfair for an entire generation of exceptional children. So it's that balance. I mean, I get that you don't have the resources and the time to do it, but at the same time, it's still not okay. And so how do we figure that out? How do we solve that? She introduces the word ableism in the next sentence, which I just think the last 2 months and beyond, but especially in the last 2 months, right? We've seen just how okay the majority of American citizens are with not only allowing ableism, but cheering on the advancement of ableism. It's just been
without even understanding that they aren't actually able. That doesn't actually apply to you. But yeah, fully cheering it on. Yeah.
I mean, I go back all the time, like when people are like, how did we get here? And I go back to that photo of the orange one making fun of the New York Times journalist who was disabled. And I'll take the photo of Trump doing it and be like, it should have ended here. This should have been the end. And the fact that it wasn't shows you how okay people are with ableism in our society. It was just... Anyway, all right, let me see. Then, continuing on my spree of notes.
Okay.
On 61, she's got a note here that says, on occasion, she's talking about the fact that we don't have visibility of neurodiverse characters in mainstream media and things like that, especially as primary characters. She says, on occasion, where a neurodiverse character is included, their different wiring is typically the focal point. And I know you're not a Schitt's Creek person, and it's devastating to me because that was one of the choices that Dan Levy made when writing that show. Was he's a pansexual individual, and I don't know if I should give a spoiler. Well, anyway, there's an LGBTQ plus storyline in the show, right? Between him and then there's other components of it. And when I have heard him in interviews afterwards say, no, there was an intentional choice there to not write the usual story arc of people objecting to their relationship and then having to overcome the obstacles. He's like, I wrote an ideal society where people couple up, share their relationship, share their love for one another with the people that are around them, and they are just embraced and accepted. And it was truly this brilliant choice in a show that really hasn't been done for the most part. And in so many things, for it to be in a sitcom that's on a network like that, it was brilliant the way it was done. Absolutely brilliant. So I'm like, yeah, we need more of that. Then she referenced Parenthood. Did you watch Parenthood, Amanda?
No. I'm certain I watched a few episodes, but like these are not shows. They're not my jam. They're just my jam.
Parenthood was incredible. And so there's reference here to Max, who's an autistic child in Parenthood. Just here to say that storyline freaking broke me. Like, I've sobbed, like ugly cried over Max's story in Parenthood. So I think it's a decent representation, obviously, but it was not easy to watch, that is for sure. Okay, then continuing on my string of notes, she talks about on 62, lastly, we have a news media, which features coverage that frequently latches onto story angles that highlight different ways of being. So if they're saying somebody robbed a bank, it's not just somebody robbed a bank. It's like an autistic individual robbed a bank. They kind of put that out there, and there's this automatic negative association that gets built. And I mean, the only thing that I could think of was how much discussion did we have about the infamous January 2025 Nazi salute. And is it because he's got Asperger's? Seriously? It's like, no, you can talk about that being connected to autism all you want, but that motion is only tied to Nazism. That is not a neurodivergent quirk that people have, right? But there you go. It was like, oh, well, we can't blame him because... No, we can blame him. It's fine.
If that's wrong, no matter what diagnosis you've got.
Okay. Then on 64, I promise I'm almost done. Then on 64, there's a thing here which says, right now, parents of typically developing kids are focusing on themselves and leaving everyone else to fend for themselves. Meaning, it's not my problem. I have my own kid to worry about. And so I just wanted to reference the fact that we did that episode, like why everyone should care about neurodivergence. And it's loaded with statistics and things like that of why neurotypical parents parenting neurotypical children should care about neurodivergence. There's 1,000,001 reasons. So if you haven't listened to that, I've been linking it when I upload the show notes. So please go When you're done listening to this one, click on it and go listen to that one.
Yeah. I guess the one thing I would say is sometimes I feel like in the book, she leans a little too hard into absolutes. And that's when you start alienating people, right? Like it gets hard when you're like, all neurotypical parents are doing this, or, and then it's like, well, as soon as you say all or never, you just lose people. And I'm totally one of those. Like I definitely am like, oh, come on. It's never all. It's never, like, so yeah. Okay, so after that, she starts a new kind of little subsection here. So we're on page 65. It's called the traditional educational model. For me, I just had pulled out a couple little things. Meagan and I, some of our ideas overlap here for sure. So on that first page in this section, she says, quote, in the United States, by law, every child has the right to access a free and appropriate education. It's the appropriate part of this guarantee where things become questionable. Most, if not all, differently wired kids think differently, process information differently, and as a result, learn differently. So it should be no surprise that securing a good education for differently wired kids is like panning for gold. And yeah, I do think that that's a struggle. It's an issue. And it's not just in the United States, right? We're specifically referring to like written regulation on the books in the United States, but it's true in most developed and developing countries. This idea that there should be a free and appropriate education, what that looks like, it's not really clear, and it's not really designed to help and support kids who fall outside of this narrow kind of definition of what normal should be. She goes on, she's talking more about it. And on page 66, she goes further into it and says, one of the more confusing aspects of IDEA, which if you're not familiar with IDEA, hopefully if you're listening to us, you are familiar because it's been in the news in the United States a lot because our head of the Department of Education didn't know what it was. But she says one of the confusing aspects of IDEA is that for a child to receive services, their ability has to prevent them from making, quote, effective progress, end quote, in school. And it's that effective progress that is so problematic because it gets tricky for lots and lots of families. In a lot of states, not all, I know there are some states where it's not like this, but in a lot of states, if your kid isn't failing, they can't get help. A diagnosis of dyslexia, a diagnosis of a specific learning disability, any of those diagnoses are not enough to automatically trigger help unless your kid is failing. And they can know and they can see it coming, and it doesn't matter until they're failing. And then you can actually get help. And I'm generally pro public school in a lot of ways, right? As between the two of us, I'm definitely more public school's the right place for a lot of kids. And when I don't shy away from that. But the reality is there's very rarely a good reason for your kid to have to fail before they get help. I can't think of hardly any situation where we as adults are like, oh no, you should definitely completely bomb before anyone helps you out or before you make any effort to course correct. Why? Why is that what we think? Yeah.
That's definitely what's best for your kid. Sure. Mm-hmm. They definitely have your kid's best interest in mind. Oh my gosh. So the next quote that I have is on page 67, and she's recounting the story of this person named Carrie, who says, we're always looking for ways to make the system bend just a little so he can feel some level of comfort in his day-to-day learning experience, but it's a constant battle. Since the state we live in doesn't recognize dyslexia as a trigger for an IEP, no one in the system was able to tweak their approach to his education in a way that was helpful. Which, when I lived in South Carolina, it was like that. I'm like, how is dyslexia not IEP worthy? I can't even. Then there's a thing a little bit further down on 68 that says there's simply no way one teacher can adequately meet the criteria of each child's IEP or 504 plan, if they even have one. in the long term and on the fly while simultaneously teaching a bevy of antsy 10-year-olds how to apply order of operations. And for me, this was one of those things like, and here's, like you just said, we differ a little bit on our view of public school. I don't think we should abolish the public school system. I don't think we should abolish the Department of Education, but I don't, I think it's flawed on a level that's like so fundamentally broken. I'm glad it's there as a safety net and I respect the work teachers are doing, but overall, I have a lot of issues. And to me, these IEPs and these 504s, having gone through this process with one of my kids, I view it as like a placebo. Like imagine you've got cancer and you're in a drug research study and you're in the 50% that got the placebo and you're completely screwed. To me, an IEP is like putting a Band-Aid on a severed artery. It's not enough. I mean, maybe if you live in some miraculous school zone that has oodles of funding and amazingly qualified special education or learning difference individuals. And but where are those stories? Those are not the stories that we hear 99% of the time. And so to me, when you've reached this IEP point, I mean, we just talked in our main episode this week about homeschooling as a privilege and not everyone can homeschool and all of that stuff. And I stand by that. But if it is at all possible, for me, once you've reached the stage, you're putting a Band-Aid on an artery. If it's bleeding out, it's just, ours wasn't worth the piece of paper it was written on. It was completely worthless. And how hard I had to fight, the amount of energy I had to expend, the amount of time I had to wait to get that useless piece of paper, absolutely ridiculous. So I know that we probably differ on the severity of that, but that's my take.
Yeah, well, and I mean, again, it's that thing I have said before. I'll continue saying I generally support public school for a wide variety of reasons. It's obviously not the route that we went. I'm very happy with the route that we went. But I do agree that public school teachers, any school, in any brick and mortar school, a teacher's got 20 plus kids for the most part that they are managing. And that in and of itself is hard enough. Managing that many kids, trying to get them to sit down, trying to get them to listen, working through it, making sure they all understand, helping the kids that don't understand, getting them all on tap. Like that in and of itself is very, very hard. And then once you start thinking about the 504s and the IEPs, the reality is it's a pretty unusual classroom that only has one student with an IEP or a 504 in it. And so now you've got a handful of those students that need more direct assistance and help. And yes, again, ideally, the school is going to have one-on-ones or people who can come in and give those kids the help, but the money isn't there. And now the money really isn't going to be there. And so it's very, very unrealistic to expect teachers to be able to address all of the needs in their classroom. And then everyone ends up suffering. And the book points, your neurotypical students are suffering, your kiddos who are on the 504s and the IEP, they're suffering, they're not getting what they need. It's a really challenging situation, even in the best schools. And I don't think we can sugarcoat that. And I don't think it's getting any better. I think that's a huge part of why there are so many teachers who are retiring and struggling. And then on top of all of that, now we expect them to be willing to put their lives on the line, their literal bodies on the line to protect their students if necessary. And now they also have to know ICE laws and immigration. I mean, like the list goes on. And then we're like, well, they don't need to make more than a barely livable wage. They get 2 months of summer off. Like
I know.
We need it. Yeah.
And just 5 short years ago during the pandemic, it was like teachers deserve everything, right? And now here we are 5 years later, and it's like, hack the budget, too much spending.
Yeah,
they were underfunded.
Yeah, exactly. They were underfunded before. Now they're super underfunded. It's a mess. But getting rid of the Department of Education and all federal oversight is also not the answer. There's no matter how much we disagree on public school and what's going on, we can both very much agree that that's not the answer.
Yes.
Yeah. All right. And so I have the next comment. This is a long chapter. So on page 69, it's a long chapter. We made it a long chapter with all of our comments because what's new? Anyway, on page 69, she has a quote. She says, "So what does all of this mean? It means the most affordable, read free or mostly free, most accessible, and most protected form of education for differently wired kids comes with a lot of potential stumbling blocks. And again, that's what we've just been talking about. It's important to know that, right? Like, you are entitled in the United States, at least at this point, you are entitled to a free education, right? No matter what diagnosis you have, no matter what kind of learning differences you have, you are entitled to a free education. But it's hard. It's not clear. It's not straightforward. It's not easy. But I also thought the next part of this paragraph was really important to remember. And sometimes I think we forget it because we're so tied into this, well, we've done this for our kiddos and they're really thriving. But she goes on to say, of course, there are differently wired kids who do just fine in mainstream education. Their success depends on multiple factors, such as their specific neurodifferences, a school's flexibility and willingness to accommodate, teachers' ability to meet their needs, and the parents' level of engagement. And I think all of those things are true, but I do think it's important to remember that there are differently wired kids who do just fine in mainstream education. And so, yes, we sit here and we talk about how if it's at all possible, we think homeschooling is a great way to go and all of these sorts of things. But don't be listening to this and think we just can't do that. Or maybe you're one of those differently wired kids who are like, well, looking back, yeah, of course, there are some things that I wish were different, but I'm quite successful as an adult. Like I'm doing just fine. And I kind of resent the fact that you're implying I can't do just fine. And my kid can't do just fine because I went through the public education system. It's important to remember there are options. We're really happy with what we're doing and how we're doing it. But that does not mean that you can't come out of the public education system successfully.
Mm-hmm. Good point. All right. So we do have some more of chapter 4 to discuss. We're doing pretty well. But before we finish up, we just want to take a quick moment to remind you that we have a Teachers Pay Teacher shop where we house our secular progressive themed unit studies. If you're sick and tired of having to weed through materials, removing whitewashed ick and religious references, join the club. We are too. Our content is open and go if you are secular and progressive. We've vetted the content. We focus on own voice resources for your learning experience. We have unit studies on the labor movement, Japanese internment during World War II, which PS is super timely right now since the orange asshole has implemented the Alien Enemies Act again. We've got world wildlife conservation, women in medicine. I mean, tons more. Our one for next month, which I'm super pumped about, is Freedom Day, which focuses on the first open election in South Africa in 1994. I'm working from memory. I think it was 94. Super pumped about that. So we'll link our shop in the show notes. Feel free to check them out. And PS, we love it when people share their unit study projects in our Facebook group and all that kind of stuff. It makes our day. So anyway, thank you. Back to the book.
Yeah, for sure. All right. So we are in a new section. It has the subheading private school. So when she was talking about the traditional model and public school, she talked about how charter schools also fall under that. That depends, right? Like where you are. Charter schools are sometimes fully private schools, but in a lot of states now, charter schools are considered fully public schools, though she points out that charter schools don't always have to fully implement the rules and regulations around IDEA. Charter schools don't have to have the same level of special education resources and accommodations and things like that. They do, depending on where you are. It's complicated. Charter schools are complicated in the United States because they vary by state and things like that. But if charter schools don't always have to follow the rules, private schools very rarely do. And so I think that's one of those things. It's worth mentioning. It's worth remembering. If you choose to do private school, they may or may not have any training at all about working with the accommodations that would come with a 504 or an IEP. I know in a specific situation we were in, the teacher was like, in my 30-some years of teaching, I've never had a student with ADHD, so I don't really know how this works. And like,
seriously,
you probably have, but the parents didn't have the diagnosis of ADHD and autism spectrum disorder. And so you didn't know, but just because you didn't know doesn't mean that you can be like, well, we're just going to treat them like any other student and hope it all goes well.
Parents hit it because you can't get into a private school by advertising that fact. So yeah, we looked into private school before we made the decision to homeschool. And there's this parenting coach that I used to work with who I thought was amazing. And I talked to her about it and she goes, I went to private school. So I knew, right? Logically, I knew this. She goes, you're going to have the same problems in private school that you have in public school, but your kid will be sitting in a much nicer desk. It's like, okay, good point. Thank you very much. And I was like, no, that is true. That was how it went when I grew up. So I'm like, no, I got you. All right. I have the next note on page 69, which says these schools weren't conceived to support different ways of learning. And it reminded me of that quote where people say like the system is broken. And then the response is always like, no, the system isn't broken. It's functioning exactly the way it was designed. And it was designed for people like this to not succeed. Or if you want to flip it the opposite, right? That sounds very nefarious. Like it was designed to make these people fail. Okay, flip it on its head. It was designed to make those people succeed. And it was designed with another population in mind. So I thought that was an interesting quote. And then continuing on that page, she says, but the fact remains that many of our kids struggle to navigate a system that was initially designed to teach compliant, neurotypical students who learn in a very specific way. True story, right? On 71, she starts this section called homeschooling. As Amanda said, it's kind of broken out into sections. So what's here says, when the traditional education model isn't working for our kids and we have the resources and the ability to consciously opt out, or we get there by default because we've burned through the school options available to us, many families raising differently wired kids ultimately homeschool. According to the National Center for Education Statistics, about 5% of homeschooled children in the U.S. are homeschooled because their parents or caregivers have deemed it the best option for meeting their child's specific needs. And number one, I feel like that number is probably low.
There's no way that's there.
Yeah, I was like, it's either a lack of reporting, a lack of official diagnosis, the fact that the statistic is old, whatever the case might be. But I didn't feel like that was it. But, I think we talked about this. We did an episode way back in the first season about why are homeschoolers called weird. And for me, it's that chicken or the egg situation. It's like these kids that are being homeschooled, my kids, people would look at them and be like, those are some weird kids. But you know what? My kids are neurodivergent. They were going to get called weird in any environment that you put them in because they don't fit that very specific model of what society considers quote unquote normal. So it's like sometimes when homeschoolers get called weird, we're called weird because our kids are neurodivergent and don't fit the system, or because they have a parent who FYI is also neurodivergent. But then on top of it is just like this like unestablishment hippie who doesn't want to be part of that very rigid system. And the fact that I look at the public school system that way is not typical. There's plenty of people who, when their kids turn 5, they march down to the end of the block and put their kids in school, and that's totally fine and it works for them. It does not work for us. And so just the virtue of the fact that that's not the way we choose to do life is weird already. And then the fact that you have all these neurodivergent kids who are in school, they would get labeled quirky or whatever. But for some reason, when they're homeschoolers, there's this like knee-jerk reaction to calling them weird. Call them whatever you want, but whatever environment you put them in, they're still going to be that person.
Yeah, whether they're masking and hiding it and trying to look normal or seem normal, quote unquote normal, or not, they're still who they are. They're still fundamentally the person they are.
Mm-hmm.
Might just be one of those situations where they don't get to be that person until they're out of school and on their own. And now they get to be their true, authentic self, which I'm not sure any of us are really advocating for that. If you're following along, if you've just tuned in for this episode, you might be like, well, what's wrong with that? But if you're a Homeschool Moms Unfiltered fan, hopefully you're not like, I don't care who my kid pretends to be as long as they don't be their authentic self until they're in their 20s.
No, they're called weird.
Yeah. Okay, so then I kind of had the next note, it looks like. On page 72 in this homeschooling section, she has a quote. She says, but like any solution, homeschooling isn't always perfect, nor is it an option for every family. Many families can't afford to have the parent stay home from work to teach their child. And then single parent households, the chances of homeschooling as a viable option is even slimmer. Though an increasing number of parents are working from home and managing to juggle a job and homeschooling. And I just thought it was interesting that it was in this book. We talked about the book is almost 10 years old. But we just talked about that earlier this week. If you haven't listened to our regular podcast that comes out on Tuesdays, like we literally just talked about this during our regular podcast. It's still a thing. It hasn't gone away. I don't think it's going away anytime soon. It is what it is. This is where we're at. So then the next section on page 73, we're starting. It's called The Broken System. And let's see, which one of us? I guess I have the first quote on this one as well. So on page 73, in the second paragraph, she says, there is no step-by-step handbook to tell parents like us where to start, how to find resources, how to navigate insurance companies, coverage plans, or even what kind of help we should be looking for in the first place. And it was just one of those kind of like, yes, preach there, like, yeah, and singing to the choir, all of the weird religious idioms that we use in everyday life, right? So yeah, totally true. If you've been following along, right, like this idea of the broken system, we've covered it so many times in our podcast in general. We've talked about it here in this book club specific podcast. And so, yeah, we didn't really pull a lot of things out of this specific section because it just feels like we're saying the same things over and over. But then that brings us right to the next subheading, which is called Us, Parents of Atypical Developing Children.
Yeah, I liked the opening here, right? Where she says, because I earlier spelled out the ways in which parents with typically developing children play a paramount role in keeping differently wired kids stuck. It's time for the rest of us to take a good hard look in the mirror because, like it or not, and consciously or not, we, you and me and everyone else raising atypical kids are contributing to the very same outdated paradigm every day through our actions, words, and thoughts. And then on the next page, you highlighted the next page. Many of us, that was I put examples on page 76, but you actually wrote them out. Amanda, you want to read them off?
Oh, I was just going to actually read this specific paragraph because I think it's really good.
I like it.
Yeah. Just like the paragraph that you just read was, it's not like, okay, yeah, I'm there. I'm picking up what you're putting down. So she goes on and she says, many of us legitimize the current paradigm by trying to fit into it with every fiber of our being. We keep information about possible diagnoses close to the chest and focus our energies on tamping down behaviors that, although normal and fine in the context of who our kid is, might make them stand out among their peers. We desperately hire help, bring in specialists, medicate, and try to will our kids into assimilating. We've been talking about that. I think it's hard because there's this line you have to draw between, as a parent, what you share about your child and their diagnoses and their struggles and those kinds of things. And when you have younger kids, what you share and where you draw that line and how much you put out there on social media, it's a lot harder to figure out. Some families are comfortable with putting it all out there. Some are on the other side and they don't say anything at all about their kids and they don't put any pictures of their kids on social media at all. And then you've got this whole gray space in the middle where people are trying to navigate what they share and how they share it. And so I get that. And I want to acknowledge that. And it's a struggle. We get that. We struggle with that even here on the podcast. I personally choose not to share my kiddo's name. Meagan's kids are fine with it. And so just how this breaks down. But at the same time, when we are so hesitant to even say what kind of diagnosis there is, it's again that thing we talked about it in our episode earlier in the week. This, when you don't name something, you give it way more power than it deserves to have. Mm-hmm. And if you're not being out there and open with these kinds of things and just like normalizing it, it's not going to become normal.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, for sure. I totally agree. It's that fine line. But I think if we can be a little bit more open about it, if that's a comfort zone for people, it definitely helps dispel some of these stereotypes that are out there and things like that, which I think is a good thing overall for society. I like it. I will say, because we only called out that one little section, on the next page, she talks about she's all for therapy and things like that, because in the section that Amanda read, there's a line that says, we desperately hire help, bring in specialists, medicate, and try to will our kids into assimilating. And when I first read that, I was like, whoa, she clarifies on the next page, because I don't want anybody thinking like if you're medicating your child, it's only for this nefarious purpose of having them fit in. One of my kiddos takes meds and he's never been to school. It was not about fitting in at all. It was a dire need for mental health. And that will affect you whether you're in school, out of school, etc. So she's not anti-medication, she's not anti-therapy, etc. So just to clarify, if you're not reading the book, you should get the book and then you can get the complete picture. But we don't have time to do a full read aloud. If we did, it would be an audiobook, and that is already available.
It's true. And we talked about this in our regular podcasts as well, that idea of like, make sure you know your reason behind why you're doing things, right?
Mm-hmm.
None of these things get, specialists to help your kiddo with X, Y, or Z if it's a struggle and they want to be better at it, or, that further on down the road, they're going to need this skill or they're going to need that skill to be able to succeed in whatever field they picked or doing whatever they picked. Obviously, support your kid, be there for them, do all of those things, but do it because it's what they want and what they need, not because society has told you that your kid needs to sit down and be quiet and have this set of skills.
Exactly. Okay, then she goes into an exchange that she has with this doctor who was involved on her son's care as part of the team. And she says, this is on 77, by the way. And she says, I'm having a hard time differentiating between which behavior is related to his ADHD and what is just quote unquote behavior or something that he's making a choice about. And the doctor replies and says, well, Asher always has ADHD, so his behavior is always connected to that in some way. And to me, we have an episode coming up for Autism Acceptance Month, and we're going to be talking about language. But for me, this was just such an amazing example of the reason why identity first language is so important, that they're not a person with ADHD. They're an ADHD individual, or they are not a person with autism, but they are an autistic individual, because that neurotype informs everything that we do. It's not something you can turn on and turn off. And we just did Amber's book not that long ago about Black joy and Black culture and Black identity. And I've seen it compared in the same way, right? Like, you're not a person with Black, you are a Black woman, right? It is such a huge part of what informs the way you experience the world, look at the world, your history, your culture, everything. And neurology is the same, right? I mean, the brain is literally the epicenter of everything. So it's in charge of it all. So we'll talk more about identity first language during that episode. I'm pretty pumped for that, but this seemed like a pretty good example of it. Then I had another quote on 78 that says, we compromise too much. We don't think outside the box. We play small. And she's talking about ways that we as parents contribute to this situation that our differently wired children are in. We compromise too much. We don't think outside the box, and we play small. And for me, I loved that quote, because one of my least favorite sayings ever is think outside the box. Can't stand that saying, because it's still operating under the understanding or the assumption that the box is normalcy. The box is the standard way, the typical way. And you're trying to think outside that box. But that's still something that's on your mind. It's still a point of focus. It's still the thing that you're comparing yourself to. And I say, and I've said this for years, I lit the box on fire like a decade ago. It doesn't even exist. It's not something I compare to. It's not something that is in my subconscious. I don't give a shit what was in the box. I just lit it on fire and turned around and walked away. So I love the fact where she's saying, don't think small. Like, just, you can do anything in the world of homeschooling these kids. Like, you don't have to think about how you modify the stuff that's in the box for your kid. Do whatever. It's amazing. Light it on fire.
I have to admit, I don't like the saying, think outside the box. So
Hate it.
you can light it on fire, and I'll just put it in the corner. All I do with most boxes. Break it down and take it out to recycling. All right. So for me, this chapter wrapped up with this. It's just a short quote, but I just thought it was a really great way to wrap up this chapter. She says, and because we have the most at stake and the most to lose, the change has to start with us. And for me, I just thought, yeah, of course, anyone who is like, oh, this book resonates with me is also like, I don't have time for more. And so it's hard. And I get that. And as someone with chronic fatigue syndrome and all of this, like I have super limited energy as it is. I barely hold on most days. So I get this like, well, how much more do you need me to do? But there are some ways that we can change what we're doing in our own lives that can sort of ripple out and cause some pretty big differences, I think.
I think it goes to that thing too. Like we say it all the time in homeschooling circles where people are like, I'm not sure if I'm capable or qualified or whatever to teach my own kid. And it's like, we always say like, no one's going to care more about your kid's own education than you will. No one, because it's your kid. No one's going to care about their well-being, their overall journey more than you will. And so that's the thing. It starts with us. If it's not working, yes, you are qualified because you will move mountains for your child. We know that.
Yeah, that's true. All right. So that brings us to our last very small chapter, chapter 5. It's called It's Time for Something New. And I just thought the first 2 paragraphs for me, I was, all right, well, I'll read them and we can quickly discuss. So she says, quote, imagine, if you will, what your life would be like if fear, worry, or guilt were no longer part of your day-to-day parenting experience. If you could talk openly about your kids' wiring without concern that they'd be ostracized or perceived as less than. Imagine sending your child to any school or camp or club and knowing they would be treated with respect and understanding instead of punished for who they are. Imagine feeling secure in the knowledge that you could handle whatever comes down the road because you have confidence in yourself as a parent and the awareness that you're not alone. Not only do I believe everything would change, but I believe this vision is possible, and I believe it has to start with us. And now I understand that she's setting up the second half of the book and her great suggestions, and I get that, and I think there's going to be some good stuff to come. But I, unfortunately, am not sure that I believe that this vision she has painted, I don't think it's possible. And I certainly don't think it's possible while our children are still school age, given the current state of, I would say the world, but that's not really fair, at least the current state of the United States. You know,
Other countries are like, don't paint us with that brush.
Yeah, I just think like you were saying earlier, the number of people who are like so proud of ableism and all of this, and the attack on the Department of Education and all of these things, I'm just not sure that I absolutely think it's worth it to fight for it. I absolutely think it's worth it to continue fighting in that direction, but I don't see how we get there in the next 5 to 10 years where your child can show up as their authentic self out in the world and not be ostracized for it.
Mm-mm. No, it's a dangerous time. And being ostracized at this point is kind of the best possible scenario in some cases, which is really sad. Yeah. So, but this section is her setting up what's to come. So we'll dive into that next week. So I just had a couple of things to leave you with before next week. One is, she says, in the pages to come, I share my ideas for how I believe we can begin shifting this paradigm right here, right now, one thought, belief, feeling, and action at a time. And there were 2 important things that she called out here. So as we get into the tilts next week, which is what she calls them, just to keep kind of bear in mind, she says she presents the tilts in a way that makes sense to her, but they can be done in any order that makes sense for you or your kiddo. So as we go through them, don't think it's like a steady roadmap and you can't step off the track. And then number 2 is she really calls out the fact that these tilts are not heavy lift that add a ton more work to your day, because odds are if you're parenting a differently wired child, you're already really freaking tired and stressed and worn thin and burnt out. So these are not huge things. They're small changes. They're tilts. That about wraps us up for today. Remember to pop any questions that you might have for Deborah Reber in the comments. She'll be on with us. We're interviewing her next week, and then it'll air shortly thereafter. But we'll do our best to ask as many questions as possible. Our book discussion will continue next week, so we can't wait to welcome you back for that. But in the meantime, happy homeschooling.
Yeah, have a great one.